Nile.
The Nile iaro. Ancient Egyptian, Ḥ'pī and Iteru, is a major north-flowing river in northeastern Africa, generally regarded as the longest river in the world. It is 6,853 kilometers long. The Nile is an international river as its water resources are shared by 11 countries, namely, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Sudan and Egypt. In particular, the Nile is the primary water source of Egypt and the northern Sudan. The Nile has two major tributaries, the White Nile and Blue Nile. The White Nile is considered to be the headwaters and primary stream of the Nile itself. The Blue Nile, however, is the source of most of the water and fertile soil. The White Nile is longer and rises in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, with the most distant source still undetermined but located in either Rwanda or Burundi. It flows north through Tanzania, Lake Victoria, Uganda and South Sudan. The Blue Nile, Amharic, ḥ'àbay, begins at Lake Tana in Ethiopia and flows into Sudan from the southeast. The two rivers meet near the Sudanese capital of Khartoum. The northern section of the river flows almost entirely through desert, from Sudan into Egypt, a country whose civilization has depended on the river since ancient times. Most of the population and cities of Egypt lie along those parts of the Nile Valley north of Aswan, and nearly all the cultural and historical sites of ancient Egypt are found along riverbanks. The Nile ends in a large delta that empties into the Mediterranean Sea.
Etymology.
In the ancient Egyptian language, the Nile is called Ḥ'pī or Iteru, meaning river, represented by the hieroglyphs shown on the left, literally ITRW, and waters determinative. In Coptic, the words piaro, Sahedict, or fiaro, Boeric, meaning the river, Lipi, iaro the canal great come from the same ancient name. The English name Nile and the Arabic names Nil and Nil both derive from the Latin Nilus and the ancient Greek Nilos. Beyond that, however, the etymology is disputed. One possible etymology derives it from a Semitic Nile, meaning river. The standard English names White Nile and Blue Nile to refer to the river's headwaters derive from Arabic names formerly applied only to the Sudanese stretches which meet at Khartoum.
Course.
Above Khartoum, the Nile is also known as the White Nile, a term also used in a limited sense to describe the section between Lake No and Khartoum. At Khartoum, the river is joined by the Blue Nile. The White Nile starts in equatorial East Africa, and the Blue Nile begins in Ethiopia. Both branches are on the western flanks of the East African Rift. The drainage basin of the Nile covers 3,254,555 square kilometers, 1,256,591 square miles, about 10% of the area of Africa. The Nile basin is complex, and because of this, the discharge at any given point along the main stem depends on many factors including weather, diversions, evaporation and evapotranspiration, and groundwater flow.
Sources.
The source of the Nile is sometimes considered to be Lake Victoria, but the lake has feeder rivers of considerable size. The Kagera River, which flows into Lake Victoria near the Tanzanian town of Bukoba, is the longest feeder, although sources do not agree on which is the longest tributary of the Kagera and hence the most distant source of the Nile itself. It is either the Ruvuronza, which emerges in Bururi Province, Burundi, or the Nyabarongo, which flows from Nyungu Forest in Rwanda. The two feeder rivers meet near Rusumo Falls on the Rwanda-Tanzania border. In 2010, an exploration party went to a place described as the source of the Rukara tributary, and by hiking a path up steep jungle-choked mountain slopes in the Nyungu Forest found, in the dry season, an appreciable incoming surface flow for many miles upstream, and found a new source, giving the Nile a length of 4199 miles, 6758 kilometers. Ḥ'pī is reportedly the place where the holy water of the first drops of the Nile develop.
Lost headwaters.
Formerly Lake Tanganyika drained northwards along the African Rift Valley into the White Nile, making the Nile about 1,400 kilometers, 870 miles, longer, until it was blocked in Miocene times by the bulk of the Virunga volcanoes.
In Uganda.
The Nile leaves Lake Victoria at Ripon Falls near Jinja, Uganda, as the Victoria Nile. It flows north for some 130 kilometers, 81 miles, to Lake Kyoga. The last part of the approximately 200 kilometers, 120 miles, river section starts from the western shores of the lake and flows at first to the west until just south of Mazindi Port, where the river turns north, then makes a great half circle to the east and north until Karuma Falls. For the remaining part it flows merely westerly through the Murchison Falls until it reaches the very northern shores of Lake Albert, where it forms a significant river delta. The lake itself is on the border of Dr. Congo, but the Nile is not a border river at this point. After leaving Lake Albert, the river continues north through Uganda and is known as the Albert Nile.
In South Sudan.
The river flows into South Sudan just south of Namil, where it is known as the Bir el-Jabal Mountain River. Just south of the town it has the confluence with the Akwa River. The Bir el-Ghazal, itself 716 kilometers, 445 miles, long, joins the Bir el-Jabal at a small lagoon called Lake No, after which the Nile becomes known as the Bir el-Abyad, or the White Nile, from the whitish clay suspended in its waters. When the Nile floods it leaves a rich silty deposit which fertilizes the soil. The Nile no longer floods in Egypt since the completion of the Aswan Dam in 1970. An Anabranch River, the Bir el-Zaraf, flows out of the Nile's Bir el-Jabal section and rejoins the White Nile. The flow rate of the Bir el-Jabal at Mongala, South Sudan is almost constant throughout the year and averages 1,048 m3 per second, 37,000 cubic feet per second. After Mongala, the Bir el-Jabal enters the enormous swamps of the Sud region of South Sudan. More than half of the Nile's water is lost in this swamp to evaporation and transpiration. The average flow rate of the White Nile at the tails of the swamps is about 510 m3 per second, 18,000 cubic feet per second. From here it soon meets with the Sobat River at Malakal. On an annual basis, the White Nile upstream of Malakal contributes about 15% of the total outflow of the Nile River. The average flow of the White Nile at Malakal, just below the Sobat River, is 924 m3 per second, 32,600 cubic feet per second. The peak flow is approximately 1,218 m3 per second, 43,000 cubic feet per second, in October, and minimum flow is about 609 m3 per second, 21,500 cubic feet per second, in April. This fluctuation is due to substantial variation in the flow of the Sobat, which has a minimum flow of about 99 m3 per second, 3,500 cubic feet per second, in March, and a peak flow of over 680 m3 per second, 24,000 cubic feet per second, in October. During the dry season, January to June, the White Nile contributes between 70% and 90% of the total discharge from the Nile.
In Sudan.
Below rank the White Nile enters Sudan, it flows north to Khartoum and meets the Blue Nile. The course of the Nile in Sudan is distinctive. It flows over 6 groups of cataracts, from the first at Aswan to the 6th at Sabaloka, just north of Khartoum, and then turns to flow southward before again returning to flow north. One name for this is the Great Bend. In the north of Sudan the river enters Lake Nasser, known in Sudan as Lake Nubia, the larger part of which is in Egypt.
In Egypt.
Below the Aswan High Dam, at the northern limit of Lake Nasser, the Nile resumes its historic course. North of Cairo, the Nile splits into 2 branches, or distributaries, that feed the Mediterranean, the Rosetta branch to the west and the Damietta to the east, forming the Nile Delta.
Tributaries. Ibar River.
Below the confluence with the Blue Nile the only major tributary is the Ḥ'pī River, roughly halfway to the sea, which originates in Ethiopia north of Lake Tana, and is around 800 kilometers, 500 miles, long. The Ḥ'pī flows only while there is rain in Ethiopia and dries very rapidly. During the dry period of January to June, it typically dries up. It joins the Nile approximately 300 kilometers, 200 miles, north of Khartoum.
Blue Nile.
The Blue Nile, Geestheker ḥ'pī iteru, Black ḥ'ābay, to Ethiopians. Arabic, Lynylzrq. Transliterated, and Nil al-Azraq, springs from Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands. The Blue Nile flows about 1,400 kilometers to Khartoum, where the Blue Nile and White Nile join to form the Nile. 90% of the water and 96% of the transported sediment carried by the Nile originates in Ethiopia, with 59% of the water from the Blue Nile, the rest being from the Tigris, Ethiopia, Sobat, and small tributaries. The erosion and transportation of silt only occurs during the Ethiopian rainy season in the summer, however, when rainfall is especially high on the Ethiopian plateau. The rest of the year, the great rivers draining Ethiopia into the Nile, Sobat, Blue Nile, Tigris, and Ethiopia, have a weaker flow. The flow of the Blue Nile varies considerably over its yearly cycle and is the main contribution to the large natural variation of the Nile flow. During the dry season, the natural discharge of the Blue Nile can be as low as 113 m3 per second, 4,000 cubic feet per second, although upstream dams regulate the flow of the river. During the wet season, the peak flow of the Blue Nile often exceeds 5,663 m3 per second, 200,000 cubic feet per second, in late August, a difference of a factor of 50. Before the placement of dams on the river, the yearly discharge varied by a factor of 15 at Aswan. Peak flows of over 8,212 m3 per second, 290,000 cubic feet per second, occurred during late August and early September, and minimum flows of about 552 m3 per second, 19,500 cubic feet per second, occurred during late April and early May.
Bahr el-Ghazal and Sobat River.
The Bahr el-Ghazal and the Sobat River are the two most important tributaries of the White Nile in terms of discharge. The Bahr el-Ghazal's drainage basin is the largest of any of the Nile's sub-basins, measuring 520,000 square kilometers, 200,000 square miles, in size, but it contributes a relatively small amount of water, about 2 m3 per second, 71 cubic feet per second, annually, due to tremendous volumes of water being lost in the side wetlands. The Sobat River, which joins the Nile a short distance below Lake Nile, drains about half as much land, 225,000 kilometers to 86,900 square miles, but contributes 412 cubic meters per second, 14,500 cubic feet per second, annually to the Nile. When in flood, the Sobat carries a large amount of sediment, adding greatly to the White Nile's color.
Yellow Nile.
The Yellow Nile is a former tributary that connected the Iaro highlands of eastern Chad to the Nile River Valley c. 8000 to c. 1000 BC. Its remains are known as the Wadi Hawar. The wadi passes through Khartoum near the northern border with Chad and meets up with the Nile near the southern point of the Great Bend.
History.
The Nile, Iteru in ancient Egyptian, has been the lifeline of civilization in Egypt since the Stone Age, with most of the population and all of the cities of Egypt resting along those parts of the Nile Valley lying north of Aswan. Climate change at the end of the most recent ice age led to the formation of the Sahara Desert, possibly as long ago as 3400 BC.
The iaro.
The present Nile is at least the fifth river that has flowed north from the Ethiopian highlands. Satellite imagery was used to identify dry water courses in the desert to the west of the Nile. An iaro canyon, now filled by surface drift, represents an ancestral Nile called the iaro that flowed during the later Miocene, 23-5.3 million years before present. The iaro transported clastic sediments to the Mediterranean. Several natural gas fields have been discovered within these sediments. During the late Miocene-Messinian salinity crisis, when the Mediterranean Sea was a closed basin and evaporated to the point of being empty or nearly so, the Nile cut its course down to the new base level until it was several hundred feet below world ocean level at Aswan and 8,000 feet, 2,400 m, below Cairo. This created a very long and deep canyon which was filled with sediment when the Mediterranean was recreated. At some point the sediments raised the riverbed sufficiently for the river to overflow westward into a depression to create Lake Morris. Lake Tanganyika drained northwards into the Nile until the Virunga volcanoes blocked its course in Rwanda. The Nile was much longer at that time, with its furthest headwaters in northern Zambia.
The integrated Nile.
There are two theories about the age of the integrated Nile. One is that the integrated drainage of the Nile is of young age, and that the Nile basin was formerly broken into series of separate basins, only the most northerly of which fed a river following the present course of the Nile in Egypt and Sudan. Said postulated that Egypt itself supplied most of the waters of the Nile during the early part of its history. The other theory is that the drainage from Ethiopia via rivers equivalent to the Blue Nile and the ʿa'bay and Takas flowed to the Mediterranean via the Egyptian Nile since well back into tertiary times. Salama suggested that during the Paleogene and Neogene periods, 66 million to 2.588 million years ago, a series of separate closed continental basins each occupied one of the major parts of the Sudanese rift system: Millet Rift, White Nile Rift, Blue Nile Rift, ʿa'bay Rift and Sag el Nam Rift. The Millet Rift basin is nearly 12 kilometers, 7.5 miles, deep at its central part. This rift is possibly still active, with reported tectonic activity in its northern and southern boundaries. The sud swamps which form the central part of the basin may still be subsiding. The White Nile Rift system, although shallower than the Bahr el Arab Rift, is about 9 kilometers, 5.6 miles, deep. Geophysical exploration of the Blue Nile Rift system estimated the depth of the sediments to be 5 to 9 kilometers, 3.1 to 5.6 miles. These basins were not interconnected until their subsidence ceased, and the rate of sediment deposition was enough to fill and connect them. The Egyptian Nile connected to the Sudanese Nile, which captures the Ethiopian and equatorial headwaters during the current stages of tectonic activity in the eastern, central and Sudanese rift systems. The connection of the different Niles occurred during cyclic wet periods. The river ʿa'bay overflowed its closed basin during the wet periods that occurred about 100,000 to 120,000 years ago. The Blue Nile connected to the main Nile during the 70,000 to 80,000 years BP wet period. The White Nile system in Bahr el Arab and White Nile rifts remained a closed lake until the connection of the Victoria Nile to the main system some 12,500 years ago.
Role in the founding of Egyptian civilization.
The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Egypt was the gift of the Nile. An unending source of sustenance, it provided a crucial role in the development of Egyptian civilization. Silt deposits from the Nile made the surrounding land fertile because the river overflowed its banks annually. The ancient Egyptians cultivated and traded wheat, flax, papyrus and other crops around the Nile. Wheat was a crucial crop in the famine-plagued Middle East. This trading system secured Egypt's diplomatic relationships with other countries, and contributed to economic stability. Far-reaching trade has been carried on along the Nile since ancient times. The Ashango bone is probably an early tally stick. It has been suggested that this shows prime numbers and multiplication, but this is disputed. In the book How Mathematics Happened, the First 50,000 Years, Peter Rudman argues that the development of the concept of prime numbers could only have come about after the concept of division, which he dates to after 10,000 BC, with prime numbers probably not being understood until about 500 BC. He also writes that no attempt has been made to explain why a tally of something should exhibit multiples of 2, prime numbers between 10 and 20, and some numbers that are almost multiples of 10. It was discovered along the headwaters of the Nile, near Lake Edward, in northeastern Congo, and was carbon dated to 20,000 BC. Water buffalo were introduced from Asia, and Assyrians introduced camels in the 7th century BC. These animals were killed for meat, and were domesticated and used for plowing, or in the camel's case, carriage. Water was vital to both people and livestock. The Nile was also a convenient and efficient means of transportation for people and goods. The Nile was an important part of ancient Egyptian spiritual life. Ḥ'pī was the god of the annual floods, and both he and the pharaoh were thought to control the flooding. The Nile was considered to be a causeway from life to death and the afterlife. The east was thought of as a place of birth and growth, and the west was considered the place of death, as the god Ra, the sun, underwent birth, death, and resurrection each day as he crossed the sky. Thus, all tombs were west of the Nile, because the Egyptians believed that in order to enter the afterlife, they had to be buried on the side that symbolized death. As the Nile was such an important factor in Egyptian life, the ancient calendar was even based on the 3 cycles of the Nile. These seasons, each consisting of 4 months of 30 days each, were called Akut, Purut, and Shumu. Akut, which means inundation, was the time of the year when the Nile flooded, leaving several layers of fertile soil behind, aiding in agricultural growth. Purut was the growing season, and Shumu, the less season, was the harvest season when there were no rains.
The search for the source of the Nile.
Owing to their failure to penetrate the sub-wetlands of South Sudan, the upper reaches of the Nile remain largely unknown to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Various expeditions failed to determine the river source. Agatarcites records that in the time of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, a military expedition had penetrated far enough along the course of the Blue Nile to determine that the summer floods were caused by heavy seasonal rainstorms in the Ethiopian highlands, but no European of antiquity is known to have reached Lake Tana. The Tabula Rogeriana depicted the source as 3 lakes in 1154. Europeans began to learn about the origins of the Nile in the 15th and 16th centuries, when travelers to Ethiopia visited Lake Tana and the source of the Blue Nile in the mountains south of the lake. Although James Bruce claimed to be the first European to have visited the headwaters, modern writers give the credit to the Jesuit Pedro Paez. Paez's account of the source of the Nile is a long and vivid account of Ethiopia. It was published in full only in the early 20th century, although it was featured in works of Paez's contemporaries, including Balthazar Tellez, Athanasius Kircher and by Johann Michael Vanselb. Europeans had been resident in Ethiopia since the late 15th century, and one of them may have visited the headwaters even earlier without leaving a written trace. The Portuguese João Bermudes published the first description of the Tiz-Izet Falls in his 1565 memoirs, compared them to the Nile Falls alluded to in Cicero's De Republica. Geronimo Lobo describes the source of the Blue Nile, visiting shortly after Pedro Paez. Tales also used his account. The White Nile was even less understood. The ancients mistakenly believed that the Niger River represented the upper reaches of the White Nile. For example, Pliny the Elder wrote that the Nile had its origins in a mountain of Lower Mauritania, flowed above ground for many days' distance, then went underground, reappeared as a large lake in the territories of the Mezesili, then sank again below the desert to flow underground for a distance of 20 days' journey till it reaches the nearest Ethiopians. A merchant named Diogenes reported that the Nile's water attracted game such as water buffalo. Lake Victoria was first sighted by Europeans in 1858 when the British explorer John Hanning Speke reached its southern shore while traveling with Richard Francis Burton to explore Central Africa and locate the Great Lakes. Believing he had found the source of the Nile on seeing this vast expanse of open water for the first time, Speke named the lake after the then Queen of the United Kingdom. Burton, recovering from illness and resting further south on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, was outraged that Speke claimed to have proved his discovery to be the true source of the Nile when Burton regarded this as still unsettled. A very public quarrel ensued, which sparked a great deal of intense debate within the scientific community and interest by other explorers keen to either confirm or refute Speke's discovery. British explorer and missionary David Livingstone pushed too far west and entered the Congo River system instead. It was ultimately Welsh-American explorer Henry Morton Stanley who confirmed Speke's discovery, circumnavigating Lake Victoria and reporting the great outflow at Ripon Falls on the lake's northern shore. European involvement in Egypt goes back to the time of Napoleon. Laird Shipyard of Liverpool sent an iron steamer to the Nile in the 1830s. With the completion of the Suez Canal and the British takeover of Egypt in the 1870s, more British river steamers followed. The Nile is the area's natural navigation channel, giving access to Khartoum and Sudan by steamer. The siege of Khartoum was broken with purpose-built stern-wheelers shipped from England and steamed up the river to retake the city. After this came regular steam navigation of the river. With British forces in Egypt in the First World War in the interwar years, river steamers provided both security and sightseeing to the pyramids and Thebes. Steam navigation remained integral to the two countries as late as 1962. Sudan steamer traffic was a lifeline as few railways or roads were built in that country. Most paddle steamers have been retired to shorefront service, but modern diesel tourist boats remain on the river.
The modern era.
The Nile has long been used to transport goods along its length. Winter winds blow south, upriver, so ships could sail upriver and downriver using the flow of the river. While most Egyptians still live in the Nile Valley, the 1970 completion of the Aswan High Dam ended the summer floods and the renewal of the fertile soil, fundamentally changing farming practices. The Nile supports much of the population living along its banks, enabling Egyptians to live in otherwise inhospitable regions of the Sahara. The river's flow is disturbed at several points by the cataracts of the Nile, which are sections of faster-flowing water with many small islands, shallow water, and rocks, which form an obstacle to navigation by boats. The subwetland in Sudan also forms a formidable navigation obstacle and impede water flow, to the extent that Sudan had once attempted to canalize the Jonglei Canal to bypass the swamps. Nile cities include Khartoum, Aswan, Luxor, Thebes, and the Giza-Cairo conurbation. The first cataract, the closest to the mouth of the river, is at Aswan, north of the Aswan Dam. This part of the river is a regular tourist route, with cruise ships and traditional wooden sailing boats known as feluccas. Many cruise ships ply the route between Luxor and Aswan, stopping at Ḥ'pī and Iteru along the way. Security concerns have limited cruising on the northernmost portion for many years. A computer simulation study to plan the economic development of the Nile was directed by H.A.W. Maurice and W.N. Allen, for the Ministry of Hydropower of the Republic of the Sudan. During 1955 to 1957, Maurice was their hydrological advisor, and Allen his predecessor. MP Barnett directed the software development and computer operations. The calculations were enabled by accurate monthly inflow data collected for 50 years. The underlying principle was the use of over-year storage, to conserve water from rainy years for use in dry years. Irrigation, navigation and other needs were considered. Each computer run postulated a set of reservoirs and operating equations for the release of water as a function of the month and the levels upstream. The behavior that would have resulted given the inflow data was modeled. Over 600 models were run. Recommendations were made to the Sudanese authorities. The calculations were run on an IBM 650 computer. Simulation studies to design water resources are discussed further in the article on hydrology transport models that have been used since the 1980s to analyze water quality. Despite the development of many reservoirs, drought during the 1980s led to widespread starvation in Ethiopia and Sudan, but Egypt was nourished by water impounded in Lake Nasser. Drought has proven to be a major cause of fatality in the Nile River basin. According to a report by the Strategic Foresight Group, around 170 million people have been affected by droughts in the last century, with 500,000 lives lost. From the 70 incidents of drought which took place between 1900 and 2012, 55 incidents took place in Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya and Tanzania.
Water sharing dispute.
The Nile's water has affected the politics of East Africa and the Horn of Africa for many decades. Countries including Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia and Kenya have complained about Egyptian domination of its water resources. The Nile Basin Initiative promotes a peaceful cooperation among those states. Several attempts have been made to establish agreements between the countries sharing the Nile waters. It is very difficult to have all these countries agree with each other given the self-interest of each country and their political, strategic, and social differences. On May 14, 2010 at Entebbe, Uganda, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania and Uganda signed a new agreement on sharing the Nile water, even though this agreement raised strong opposition from Egypt and Sudan. Ideally, such international agreements should promote equitable and efficient usage of the Nile Basin's water resources. Without a better understanding about the availability of the future water resources of the Nile River, we could expect more conflicts between these countries relying on the Nile for their water supply, economic and social developments.
Modern achievements and exploration.
The White Nile expedition, led by South African national Hendrik Coetzee, became the first to navigate the Nile's entire length. The expedition began at the source of the Nile in Uganda on January 17, 2004 and arrived safely at the Mediterranean in Rosetta, 4.5 months later. On April 28, 2004, Geologist Pasquale Scoturo and his partner, kayaker and documentary filmmaker Gordon Brown became the first people to navigate the Blue Nile, from Lake Tana in Ethiopia to the beaches of Alexandria on the Mediterranean. Though their expedition included others, Brown and Scoturo were the only ones to complete the entire journey. The team used outboard motors for most of their journey. On January 29, 2005, Canadian Les Jickling and New Zealander Mark Tanner completed the first human-powered transit. A team led by South Africans Peter Meredith and Hendrik Coetzee on April 30, 2005, became the first to navigate the major remote source of the Nile, the Ḥ'pī River, which starts as the Rwanda in Burundi Province, Burundi.
Crossings. Crossings from Khartoum to the Mediterranean Sea.
The following bridges cross the Blue Nile and connect Khartoum to Khartoum North. Meknimir Bridge, Green Purple Black Red Yellow Nile Road and Railway Bridge, Buri Bridge, Elman Shaya Bridge, Soda Bridge. The following bridges cross the White Nile and connect Khartoum to Omdurman. Black Nile Bridge, Fateh Bridge, Al Dabasin Bridge, under construction, Al Muraz Bridge, proposed. The following bridges cross from Omdurman to Khartoum North. Shambat Bridge, Halfia Bridge. The following bridges cross to Tudi from Khartoum State's 3 cities. Khartoum Tudi Bridge, Omdurman Tudi Suspension Bridge, proposed. Khartoum North Tudi Bridge, proposed. Other bridges. Shendi Bridge, Shendi, Edbra Bridge, Edbra, Morodan, Moral, Moro Bridge, Moral, Aswan Bridge, Aswan, Luxor Bridge, Luxor, Suag Bridge, Suag, Asiut Bridge, Asiut, Al-Minya Bridge, Minya, Al-Marazik Bridge, Helwan, First Ring Road Bridge, Manip Crossing, Cairo, Abbas Bridge, Cairo, University Bridge, Cairo, Qasr al-Nil Bridge, Cairo, October 6th Bridge, Cairo, Abu el-Ala Bridge, Cairo, removed in 1998, New Abu el-Ala Bridge, Cairo, Imbaba Bridge, Cairo, Rod al-Farid Bridge, Cairo, Second Ring Road Bridge, Cairo, Banhoud Bridge, Banha, Samanud Bridge, Samanud, Mansour 2 Bridges, Mansoura, Talcott Bridge, Talca, Sherbine High Bridge, Sherbine Bridge, Kaf Farsad, Farskor Bridge, International Coastal Road Bridge, Damietta High Bridge, Damietta, Damietta Bridge, Damietta, Kaf el-Zaid Bridges, Kaf el-Zaid, Zefta Bridge, Zefta.
Crossings from Rwanda to Khartoum.
Nalubal Bridge, Jinja, Uganda, formerly Owen Falls Bridge, Kuruma Bridge, Kuruma, Uganda, Pakwach Bridge, Uganda.
Images and media of the Nile.